There's a very subtle shift that takes place within the Torah in the narrative from last week's Parsha, Parshat Yitro, in which we read of Bnei Yisrael at the foot of Mount Sinai and Moshe going up to the mountain and receiving the Aseret HaDibrot, the Torah, and everything that follows afterwards, to this morning's Parsha, Mishpatim, a series of laws that read like reading a code of law, any code of law, quite frankly. A series of judicial rulings that begins with the treatment of slaves, even as the Decalogue before it referred to the enslavement of the Israelites and their release, and to a whole sort of additional elements of law having to do with the details of organizing and running a society. And so this shift is very subtle, and it begins actually at the end of Parshat Yitro. At the end of the Torah reading, page 449 in the Chumash, if you want to follow along, Exodus 20, verse 21, we read, Mizbach Adama ta'aseli v'zavachta alav, that the Israelites are commanded to make for God an altar of earth and sacrifice on it their burnt offerings and their sacrifices of well-being. Al olotecha v'al shlomecha, those are the sacrifices. Et soncha ve'et bikarecha, of the sheep and the oxen that you will bring for these sacrifices. B'chol hamakom asher askir et shmi, in every place where I cause, meaning I, God, cause my name, avo elecha uveirachticha, where I cause my name to be mentioned, and I will come to you and bless you. It's a very subtle shift that takes place within those verses. At the end of Yitro, we have this notion that the Israelites have to build an altar, but the rabbis also read it interpretively, looking backwards with 20/20 hindsight from their own experience. That the use of B'kol Makom, in every place where God will cause God's name to be mentioned and people will be blessed, must refer to a time in which the sacrificial cult will be gone. The rabbis of the Talmud read this verse as meaning, in the time to come, when there no longer will be an altar, building a just society will therefore be equivalent to the sacrifices. That's how the rabbis read it. If you look at the beginning of Siddur Sim Shalom for Shabbat and festivals, in Birkot HaShachar, in the morning blessings, one of the first things we do in the morning traditionally when we wake up is we study Torah. And the text that the editors of the Siddur put in that place for study of Torah tells you something about what it is that is important to that society. Because we turn to the prayer book 3 times a day. And when we wake up in the morning, the first thing that the editors of Sim Shalom want us to know when we come to synagogue or when we wake up at home and we recite these texts of prayer is exactly this notion of the Talmud. This shift in a post-temple world, what takes the place of sacrifice, of the korbanot? And the answer in the Siddur Sim Shalom is Gimilut Chasadim, is acts of loving kindness, which is an extension of this Talmudic principle that comes from this verse at the end of Yitro, that there's going to come a time in the future when you're not going to build a mizbeach, you're not going to have an altar. And so already the rabbis are reading into the text as if the text is asking the question, looking to the future, prophesizing to the future, what will take its place. And what takes its place, according to the rabbis, is justice, building a just society. Now, this caught my attention. Why does the Torah so quickly transition from what one commentator calls civilization-altering experiences, the proclamations of Yitro, to the more narrowly focused legislation of Mishpatim, of this morning's Torah reading? Why does it make that transition? Because the Talmud suggests that when the sacrificial cult is gone, the way in which you build a just society is in the details of how that society is organized. And that will become the means to which one worships God. Most of us are not going to have that Sinai experience. We're not going to have that experience on the mountaintop that so thoroughly alters our lives that I'm always reminded of the Blues Brothers in this case. Jim Belushi, right, his character, he sees the light, and then he starts doing backflips through the church, and suddenly it's like we're on a mission from God. If only we could have that kind of experience where we will be awakened to the divine in our midst and in our lives in such a way. The reality is, most of us are going to find God in the details of practice. Most of us are going to find God in the spaces of the lives that we live in this world. And the purpose of the mitzvot, what Mishpatim is coming to tell us in particular, is that if we create what I like to call habits of holiness in our lives, then we can create the possibility for a just society. And Mishpatim, if we look closely, lays out for us several important hallmarks for which we can build a just society. I'm going to just highlight what I think are the most important from the Parsha, which is on page 469 of the Chumash, Exodus 22, verse 21. Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. And note the consequence that follows the ill-treatment of a widow or an orphan. In ane ta'ane oto, if you do mistreat them, ki im tza'ok yitzak elai, I will heed out their outcry, shma eshma tza'akato, as soon as they cry out to me. The consequence the Torah gives for the mistreatment of the widow and the orphan is that the moment they cry out to me, because of that mistreatment, God will respond. Now, this is fascinating. Why the almanah and yatom? Why the widow and the orphan? It's important to understand the context in which they existed in the ancient world. An almanah in the time of the Torah, a widow in the time of the Torah, is not like a widow today. Women did not work. Women were not self-sufficient. Women in the time of the Torah moved from their father's house to their husband's house. And if their husband died, the concern of the tribe was the continuation of the tribe. This is the law of yibum, of ensuring that the tribe continues, that a brother of the husband would then be responsible for marrying and taking care of the widow and ensuring children for the tribe's future. An almanah in the time of the Torah would be dependent upon her family, her tribe, to take care of her. And if they were unable to take care of her or unwilling to take care of her, she would have a real problem. She, like the orphan, who would have no tribe, no family, would become the concern of the community. And the community, therefore, would have to take responsibility for the almanah and for the orphan. What they both share in common is that they become wards of the state, basically. And as Rabbi Shai held, ooh, that's a Freudian slip. Rabbi Shai held writes, who's a colleague and a friend, Shai, forgive me. In the ancient Near East, and indeed in much of the Tanakh, it's the duty of the king to protect those who are vulnerable and exposed. In a variety of contexts, the protection of the weak was seen as the will of God, and in Israel, of God. And since the king represented God's rule on earth, it was he who was tasked with being their earthly protector. In other words, in society, in the larger society in the ancient world, the king was God's manifestation on earth. And so the king would have to take care of the vulnerable of society, and in so doing, it was as if God did so. For the Israelites, the people become God's representatives, God's manifestation on earth, and the vulnerable of society, therefore, become their charge, their well-being. Now, the widow and the orphan then lose their advocate and protector, and they're exposed to an endless social threat. Rambam, Maimonides, who El quoted also in terms of her Devar Torah on capital punishment, Rambam, not surprisingly, takes this concern of the community further to not only one's socioeconomic well-being, but also their psychological well-being too, which is not surprising for Rambam because he was also a doctor. He reads the word kol in the verse that we're talking about as meaning all of their well-being. You can't mistreat them in all ways, not just the socioeconomic ways, but the psychological ways as well. And in citing this text, Rambam says, a person ought to be especially heedful of their behavior towards widows and orphans, for their souls are exceedingly depressed and their spirits low. He continues, how are we to conduct ourselves with them? He even gives us a guideline in terms of what's the behavior, the way in which we're supposed to interact with these people that are vulnerable in our society. He says one may not speak to them otherwise than tenderly. One must show them unvarying courtesy, not hurt them with physical or hard toil, nor wound their feelings with hard speech. One must take greater care of their property than one's own, and whoever irritates them, provokes them to anger, pains them, tyrannizes over them, or causes them loss of money, is guilty of a transgression, and all the more so if one beats them or curses them. One can imagine, therefore, God's wrath coming out against those who mistreat the almanah and the yatom, the orphan and the widow in society. Now, I was thinking about this in the sense of who are the vulnerable in our society today. And of course, we could go down a whole litany of people and of groups that are vulnerable in our society. In the last couple of weeks, we as Jews have felt vulnerable yet again in our society with the rise of anti-Semitism and the events that took place in Colleyville, Texas. We continue, to feel vulnerable. Thursday was the third annual United Nations Holocaust Remembrance Day. And we told yet again the stories of our family members, our community members who perished in the Holocaust. Rosette had a yard site today for her mother and her grandmother, who were survivors of the war. And it really dawned on me, listening to people's stories over the last couple days, and you put that in the context in which we're living, we Jews certainly feel like we're vulnerable again. But we're not the only ones. We're aware of all the other vulnerabilities that are happening in our society in terms of race relations and systemic racism, in terms of people suffering from illness or from loss, from great kinds of vulnerabilities to things that perhaps for us on the outside might seem minor, but for the person who's going through it, the entire future of the world rests on it. But what caught my mind about vulnerability in particular was a study that came out last week that said that only 1 in 10 Canadians consider themselves happy lately. 1 in 10 consider themselves happy. The vulnerability of those suffering from anxiety, depression, and mental health challenges during COVID has skyrocketed. That's the same number that it was 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. 1 in 10 feel happy. That means 9 in 10 are feeling stressed, anxious, depressed. It's no wonder that in the time of COVID, the work that we do at Beth Tzedec, our spiritual leadership team, our pastoral care work, has gone up by 35%. We're averaging 65 pastoral calls a month. They last 30 to 45 minutes. For half of the people that we speak to, they're ongoing contacts and discussions, a lot of listening. For the other halves, it's usually one-off. People just wanted somebody to talk to and to express themselves. 400 people a year, just in our congregation, at this moment, are engaging with us for pastoral care. It verifies this number of 1 in 10. That's how heavy it is. And what's amazing is that with the technology and the fact that we're able to reach out beyond Beth Tzedec and our own membership, there are a few people, we don't do a lot of this, but there are a few people who are contacting us from places far away because we say on a regular basis, we retweet the mental health awareness days, the suicide prevention numbers, and Rabbi Friar Botzen, Yaakov Fruchter, Rabbi Friedman Cole, and I say, if you're in need, call us. And you know what happens when you do that? People call. There's a gentleman in Montreal who I don't know who was having thoughts of suicide, and he sent me a direct message on Twitter, and we responded and got him at least into a place where he has the resources to deal with his feelings of depression. Part of his issues also had to do with immigration issues. So we put him in touch with Jais because we had that connection. Now, Jais couldn't help him with his particular immigration issues. But the point is that when people call out, we respond. Whether they're here in Toronto, or they're in Montreal, or they're someplace else. Because what we're seeing is there are a lot of vulnerable people today who are suffering from anxiety, depression, loneliness, sadness, such that only 1 in 10 might feel happy. Now, most of us that are here today at Beth Tzedec are feeling happy. Thank you, Elle. It is so important to have opportunities to come together and to celebrate. To celebrate a young person coming to Torah, to teaching Torah so beautifully, to bring her family together both within the shul and through distance. We don't get enough of that. The last couple of years have been really, really hard. Even our smechot are weighted down by the pressures of this pandemic. So what do we do about it? We turn to the Parsha. We focus our attention, as always, on the details of our lives. And one of those details, the message of the Parsha, is to take care of the vulnerable within our midst. When we do that, we create a decent society. For a decent society will ultimately be judged on how it treats the vulnerable. The ger, the yatom, the almanah, the oneh, the stranger, the widow, the poor, the orphan, those who are powerless in its midst. We have a lot of work to do, but we at Beth Tzedec strive constantly to live up to our name, to be a Beit Tzedec, a house of justice that lives by these values and strives to create such a society. Shabbat Shalom.